Dear students, welcome again to Lecture 10. We are now moving into Episode 2. It's about the 10 measures of bundles of political instruments for the low-carbon transformation. We already discussed the context for the policies, and we are now coming to concrete policy dimensions and which kind of policies we actually do have in mind. In terms of learning outcomes, I do have two important basic points. You will understand the 10 most relevant areas of action for the low-carbon transformation, which we are discussing in detail in the report. And you will understand the relevance of bottom-up strategies on the one hand side and big push elements on the other hand side. And I will talk about these different types of policies in a minute. Starting with the first slide, it is integrating the different arguments which I already made in Episode 2 regarding the role of policies on the one hand side and the role of other actors in our societies and economies on the other hand side. What you can see here is that political actors, economic actors and science are playing a major role in the low-carbon transformation. They need to define their contributions to the low-carbon transformation process. And in the middle you see the social contract. Because our argument is that if this local contract would not emerge, the possibilities, the chances, the opportunities to make the low-carbon transformation really possible are very low. So policies can do a lot, but the social contract is basic from our point of perspective. This is about the participation of people, of business and state actors in the low-carbon process. And now we go into the policies which we see which might enable the whole process. On this slide we see criteria for transformative strategies, because what we reflect on in this report is not only any policy initiatives, it is about transformative strategies. You might remember the slide where we discussed the major barriers and the major fostering factors, and we saw that the barriers are difficult. And these criteria belong to this discussion. What kind of criteria do we have to measure our policies in terms of are these really transformative strategies and policies which we are talking about? And we are coming up with 7 major criteria for transformative policies. The first one is scale, because we observed that in many countries we already have pilots, low-carbon pilots in our economies, in the energy sector, in our universities, certain master programs where low-carbon and sustainability issues play a role. But we need big-scale initiatives. We need to scale up pilots to make systemic change possible. Then it is about acceleration. Acceleration is very important because we saw at the beginning of our lectures that to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor, we are under time pressure. We need to make the whole transformation, the decarbonization of the global economy during the next 4 decades to come. But we need to make the major policy shifts during the next decade to come. So time pressure is there. Acceleration is possible. How can we speed up activities? This is the second criteria. The third criteria is about long-term directional changes and avoid path dependencies. So the point here is that we know that we need to change complex structures in our economies. We cannot do this during the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years to come, but these are the normal policy cycles. So we argue for long-term perspectives and long-term goals to make the low-carbon transformation really feasible. The fourth element initiate system reforms. System reforms imply that we go beyond isolated policy measures. We have been discussing the urbanization issue. So if we would like to transform urban areas into low-carbon urban areas, we need to bring together transport reforms. We need new types of architectures. We need infrastructure measures. And these kind of issues need to be integrated. So system reforms are very important. The fifth element is that we need a global extent of the transformation processes, because we discussed that the low-carbon transformation need to take place in many parts of the global economy to stay really in the 2 degrees Celsius corridor. And this implies that local low-carbon economy reforms are very important. But at the end of the day, we need a global transformation processes. This is why global cooperation is very important, and I will come back to this point in a minute. The sixth element is that We need to convince people. We need to activate people. We need legitimacy for this process. It's not only about technocratic reforms. It's not only about innovation and technology. As we have been discussed many times already, it's about huge shifts in our societies. And therefore, the role, the active role of people, of citizens, is very important. And the last criteria, which we do have here on this list, is the potential of overcoming barriers and path dependencies. We have been emphasizing this point, and we thought about policies which have the power to really overcome long-term path dependencies, and you will see with which kind of reflections we came up. So these are the criteria for transformative policy strategies. Here we do have the 10 bundles of instruments which we are discussing in detail in the report. We do have 10 areas of policy changes which we discuss. And I will go through the list, and you will see that they are on the one hand side related to our major economic sectors where low carbon transformations are necessary. But on the other hand side, they go beyond the 3 sectors which we discussed, which were, as you might remember, energy, urbanization, and land use change. So the first area which we see of transformation is the role of the state. The role of what we call a proactive and enabling state. I'm coming back to this in a minute. The second bundle of instruments is about a price for carbon, and I will come back to this element in a minute. The third element is the energy dimension and the importance of regional energy cooperation. We emphasize this point, and I will not go into the details here because we already discussed many of these elements in another lecture. But the regional dimension is very important for one reason. We demonstrate in our report that if we make these low-carbon transformations in regions, we can reduce the costs in the energy reform process considerably. We demonstrate for the European case that the costs for regional energy transformation in Europe as a whole will between 20 and 30% be cheaper than if we do it on the national levels only. The fourth element here is about internationalizing feed-in tariffs. And as an example, we take the Desertec initiative in Africa. This is, as you know, the energy cooperation between Europe and Northern Africa in order to make the renewable energy resources of Northern Africa accessible for Europe. We perceive this as very important because to make renewable energies as cheap as possible, we should go to the sources where these energies are cheapest. And these kind of sources, if you think about solar energy resources, of course, are much cheaper in Northern Africa than they are in Europe. So cooperation between Europe and Africa is therefore very important, and we reflect how to manage this kind of cooperation most effectively. The fifth element here, the fifth bundle of instrument which we do have in mind, is how to reduce energy poverty and how to combine with the reduction of energy poverty with low carbon technologies. This is a very important point because on the one hand side, in terms of volume, the focus is on those countries where energy consumption is high. But on the other hand side, we do have still in the global economy 2 billion people which do not even have access to modern energy resources. So we argue that this should be part of the whole package of the low carbon transformation. We also need to think on the bottom billion which have energy access problems. And what we demonstrate here is that currently people in sub-Saharan Africa, where in many countries between 50 to 80% of the people do not have access to energy resources, these people in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa are paying the highest prices for energy worldwide. The poorest people are paying the highest prices in the global economy. If you produce energy with diesel generators in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a business as usual practice to organize energy access for poor people, this kind of energy costs per kilowatt hour around 50 cents. I'm paying myself 19 cents. So how to make low carbon energy sources make accessible for poor people? This is the fifth arena which we discuss, and we show that technologically this is feasible, but we need to subsidize the access to and the creation of these kind of low-carbon energy structures in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa and other developing regions of the global economy. The sixth point is on low-carbon urbanization. We discussed the importance of the urbanization dynamics in the global economy for low-carbon transformation. Therefore, this is a major area where policy needs to take place. It is about transport reform sectors. It is about low-carbon architecture in sectors. It is about lifestyles in cities and how these kind of policies can come together to make low-carbon urbanization dynamics possible worldwide. In OECD countries, this is about the reorganization of existing cities. In newly emerging economies, it is about new cities, because the global urbanization shift is taking place in developing countries. So there it is about new cities where we can and have the chance to build low-carbon urbanization structures from scratch. Then you see the seventh point here. It's about low-carbon land use. This is about how we need to redesign our agricultural policies to make low-carbon land use and low-carbon agriculture possible. We demonstrate in our report that we know how to do this. And we demonstrate in our report that it's not a cost factor. We show that the prices for low-carbon agriculture on the one hand side and high-carbon agriculture on the other hand side are similar. This is much more a question of mindset. This is much more a question of path dependencies. So we demonstrate low-carbon land use strategies and low-carbon agricultural policies in this dimension. The point number 8 is finance mechanisms. As you might remember, we argued that we can finance the whole low-carbon transformation process. We argued and demonstrated that most economists which are working on these kind of challenges demonstrate that around 2% of the global GDP need to be invested in low-carbon transformation processes during the next 2, 3, 4 decades to come towards mid of the 21st century. But the important point is that we need big upfront investments. If you observe the whole investment cycle, very often low-carbon investments over the whole investment cycle are cheaper than low-carbon investments. But if you go for low-carbon investments, the upfront investments are higher because we need to build up a new energy structure, for example, or a new urban structure. So pre-investments. And what we discuss is elements of subsidies and loans which make these low-carbon investments possible, which are higher in the first phase and will reduce cost reductions in the later cycle of the investment process. The element number 9 is how do we need to rethink research activities and the science systems when it comes to the low-carbon transformation. And I will come back to this point in a minute. And the last element of our 10 bundles of instruments is about the the global governance dimension of the low-carbon transformation. And I will also come back to this element in a minute. So in the next minutes to come, I would like to focus on the 4 elements which you see on this slide, which are in red. I would like to come firstly rapidly back to the role of the state. I would like to come to focus on the price for carbon issue, and I will then go into the low-carbon research strategies and low-carbon science systems and the global governance activities. And I would like to ask you to go to the other areas, which I'm not going to discuss in detail because time is limited, reading the report. So let's focus on these 4 bundles of instruments, which from our perspective are very important. The first element is the proactive state, the enabling state. And your question might be, why is an enabling state, a proactive state, so important for making the low-carbon transformation possible? It's about economic growth and it's about investments. It's about business cases. Why the state? And then a proactive state, an enabling state. And the argument here is that if you look into our economies, we argued that in most economies around the world, the economic frameworks, the economic institutional incentives are still high carbon and non-sustainability oriented. So what we need is a state who reduces these incentive schemes or reorganizes these incentive schemes, which are still driving non-sustainable growth, into incentive schemes and policy structures which enables low-carbon growth. If you don't do that, if you don't bring down these barriers in terms of institutions and policy packages which are driving high carbon growth still in many countries, if you don't do that, innovations in the private sector are very little probable. So building up state capabilities and building up institutional policy frameworks enabling low-carbon development is absolutely key. I'm giving you one example for that. We do have currently in the global economy subsidies for high-carbon and fossil-based energy carriers in a magnitude of between 400 and 600 billion US dollars per year. This is not the market. This is about policies. So if you don't reorganize this kind of policies, you will not get a low-carbon transformation. So an enabling state reorganizing the framework towards a low-carbon oriented institutional setting is very important. And this is necessary in each and every sector of our economies. So we need low-carbon urban structures and policies. We need low-carbon energy policies. We need low-carbon agricultural policies. We need low-carbon oriented science policies. And this is a role of the state. These are public goods and these are public institutional settings. If we don't change that, private business will not go towards low-carbon investments on a large scale. This is the first point. The second point is about price, the price for carbon. And why is this important? The price for carbon is important because a market economy is based on price systems. So you buy what is cheapest. People invest where profits are high. The price is the major driver of economic decisions. So as long as we do not have a price for carbon, we will not have efficiency in terms of the use of carbon and the emissions of carbon. There are two major possibilities to create a price for carbon. The first possibility is you go for a tax on carbon. This might be a move forward, but probably you will have to adopt this kind of tax very oftenly, seeing that the price which you added in addition to the existing cost structures was not high enough to get the reduction of carbon emissions which you would like to see. So you need to shift your policies from time to time. This is difficult in terms of convincing your citizens. So we argue for emission trading scheme. And I'm coming to the slide which you are seeing now here. Several years ago in 2008, before the Copenhagen climate conference took place, we designed an optimal, low carbon oriented emission trading scheme for the global level. And the argument was the following, and I'm then coming to this slide here. The argument was that we know that if you would like to stay below the 2 degrees global warming line, we do have from now on to 2050 a global greenhouse gas budget of 750 gigatons. And we would like to limit the global emissions during the next 4 decades to come, towards 2050, we would like to limit the emissions on 750 gigatons, a cap. And then the question is how to distribute these limited carbon emissions. Because if we would maintain with our emissions, if we see them today, we would run out of this global greenhouse gas budget of 750 gigatons during the next more or less 20 years. So the budget is very small. It's a justice problem. It's a distributional problem. So our argument is very easy. We argue that the only robust justice criteria which people around the world will accept, and we need this kind of global acceptance for having a global agreement, the only just criteria is equal per capita emission worldwide for the 7 billion people we have. So if you do that, you come up with an individual carbon budget for the next 40 years to come, which will have a volume of more or less 110 tons per person. And we argue then that we should aggregate these individual carbon budgets to national carbon budgets. So every nation gets its carbon budget. And based on these national carbon budgets, you then start to negotiate and trade your carbon certificates. And what you can see here in this slide, on the right-hand side, the right column, is how long these national carbon budgets would last based on this kind of formula. And you can see for the case of Germany, it's only several years. It's only several years also for the United States. When you look towards emerging economies, Mexico, for example, the Mexican budget would only last for 25 years. So it would not last towards 2050. What you can see here is that many countries are already under huge carbon stress. We might talk about carbon insolvency in many countries already. And then we do have countries, India, for example, Burkina Faso is here, which do emit little. And they can therefore trade their certificates. And this is the basic idea. The basic idea is, and this is the next slide, that we will have countries, the red ones here, rich countries, OECD countries, they need to buy certificates in order to manage their low carbon transformation. We then have the yellow countries here. These are more or less the emerging economies. Even those need to buy certificates starting in 2020, 2025. And then we do have a bigger number of developing countries. They do have much more certificates than they will use and consume. So they will sell their certificates. And the major point here is that this kind of emission trading scheme would produce carbon efficiency incentives for both types of countries, for high carbon emitters and for low carbon emitters. Because for high carbon emitters, if you are not carbon efficient, you need to buy many certificates, and the prices for those will rise because we saw that the budget is very limited. And for the low carbon emitters, there's also a strong incentive to be carbon efficient because you can sell that. If you are able to consume and to emit little carbon, you can sell your certificates. So we do have an incentive for both country types to be carbon efficient. Having a price for carbon is the single most important economic instrument to make the low carbon transformation possible. So this is the price issue. I have been talking about the state and I've been talking about the price. We need both. We need a state creating an incentive scheme for low carbon activities in any sector, and we need a price system which is really signaling the scarcity of the emission budget which is still available, and it is a small emission budget. So this is state and this is the price, and we argue in favor of a global emission trading scheme. The third point which I wanted to focus on in this lecture is the science system. So in our report we describe how the economy needs to change. We describe how the energy system needs to change. We describe how urban areas need to be reformed. And if this is the case, we have to reflect also on how to organize our research and science systems to contribute to this low carbon transformation. If any sector needs to change, our sector also needs to change. Because the observation is that the low carbon transformation process is still not well reflected in our science systems. And we are focusing on several directions which we would like to see emerge in the international research and science system. The first point which we're arguing for, based on our study and based on the report, is that we need much more interdisciplinary research between different faculties, between different disciplines, to understand better which kind of transformation processes are necessary. We have been discussing in our lectures the transformation of the urban areas. And we saw that many different disciplines need to contribute to that. We need architects reflecting on low carbon architecture. We need employment specialists reflecting on how the impacts of low carbon investments are looking like in urban areas for the employment sector. We need transport sector experts. We need waste manager experts. So we have to bring together very different disciplines in a short period of time. And for all of you which are working in universities, you know that very often in our disciplines we are working in silos. Interdisciplinarity is not mainstream. Interdisciplinarity is still a smaller part of our science system. In order to understand these transformation processes better, we need more interdisciplinarity, and we make the case to make more interdisciplinarity research possible. There is a second very important point which we emphasize, and the second important point is that we need to communicate our results to people. This is important because the low-carbon transformation is not, as I already argued, a technocratic exercise. We need to bring people in. People need to understand the urgency of climate change, the urgency of the planetary boundary issue. So bringing people into knowledge discourses is very important. If we ask for radical transformation processes, we do have the case of the German energy transformation process currently. You need to convince the people that this is necessary, that the investments which we are taking and the taxes which are currently rising for make the transformation possible today, to avoid costs and damages in the future and to reduce costs in the future, this kind of arguments need to be debated. So researchers need to bring their information towards people, communication. We then have to bring low-carbon issues and low-carbon challenges, which we discuss in our report, into the research institutions. We argue for low-carbon business schools. We argue for low-carbon architecture schools. We argue for bringing the Earth system knowledge and Earth system research, which is currently being undertaken by natural scientists, together with economic research. And currently there are very few bridges between these two different kinds of silos. So we argue for new research arenas which we perceive as relevant for the low-carbon transformation. This is the third element. Low-carbon business schools, low-carbon architecture schools, bringing natural scientists, engineers, and social scientists together. We even have in mind to create something like low-carbon transformation-oriented universities. We could imagine the creation of universities which, in their entire program, in their entire research activities, focus on this kind of great transformation. The fourth and the last element which we discuss regarding the reorganization of the science system is that we would like to see much more scientists from developing countries being part of our research programs. If we really would like to move forward global transformation processes, we need research being done also in developing countries for two reasons. The first reason is we need the knowledge from the ground. And people working in these developing countries do have a much better empirical understanding of what is going on in their countries than OECD country researchers in their offices in Washington, Berlin, or Rome. So bringing developing country experts in is important for this reason. The second reason is that joint knowledge production for low-carbon transformation produces legitimacy. Joint knowledge production is an important mechanism to organize legitimacy. So we therefore ask for higher investments in low-carbon research activities in developing countries. We call this a 360-degree perspective of research. Currently, most investments in research and science are made in OECD countries. Recently, in emerging economies, we call for higher investments in research in all these economies. So this is the research perspective. This is the reorganization of the science system. And I'm coming to the global cooperation perspective now. This is the last area which I would like to focus on. I talked about the state. I talked about price mechanisms and emission trading. I have been talking about research and science. Now it's about global cooperation, because we argued several times that this transformation has to be global. What we do have here is a citation from Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom, as you know, has been working a lot on commons, on local commons and on global commons. And the citation here, the first one, which you see on this slide, argues that cooperation in many areas and in many constellations is possible, and we know how to solve collective action problems, but it is not necessary. And this implies that we need strategies for international cooperation. We need actors willing to invest in the most important ingredients of international cooperation. She is arguing here that trust-building processes are very important, that having in mind reciprocity, so if you gain, I gain also, mechanisms are very important. And it is about reputation. It is about the real willingness of demonstrating that you are not only urging other actors to do something, in developing cooperation, for example, but you do it yourself. And gaining your reputation helps you to be an international actor which is able to organize and manage and foster international cooperation processes. So international cooperation is possible, but it fails, and this is what research currently is demonstrating. This slide emphasizes several arenas where global governance activities need to be pushed forward, and this is only a selection of what we are discussing in the report. But I would like to focus on these 4 different elements. Let's start with the first ones, pioneer alliances. We argue in our report that multilateral inclusive strategies and negotiation processes are very often very slow. We see this in the negotiation of climate policies in the UNFCCC. Therefore, we argue not against these multilateral negotiation fora, we are in favor of those, but we argue that in addition to that and parallel to that, we should invest in pioneer alliances. Pioneer alliances, for example, between states and governments. States and governments which are already moving into low-carbon directions could work together and organize reciprocal cooperation benefits. So if Germany and other European countries, and let's say China and Brazil, would go for low-carbon joint activities in the field of research investments or training, this would produce cooperation benefits for all actors. And this is why we argue for pioneer alliances. But it is not only about governments and states. It's also about private businesses. There are several initiatives worldwide where private actors, civil society actors and business actors are working together into green directions, into low-carbon directions. And we can scale those up. And we can learn from those. I will give you only one example. Currently, Conservation International, a US civil society organization working for green investments and saving the forests worldwide, is cooperating with Walmart. Walmart is the biggest trader worldwide. Walmart is responsible for several percentages of global trade. So if Walmart reorganizes its global value chain, this has an impact internationally in the global economy. Conservation International tries to push Walmart into this direction. So this is also a pioneer alliance, and there are other ones which we can learn from and which we can replicate in other areas. So pioneer alliances is what we do have in mind, in addition to multilateral processes which are necessary to organize global consensus in certain areas, but pioneer alliances are more rapid than inclusive and broad multilateral processes. You might remember that we talked about how to accelerate processes towards low carbon. This is one element where we can accelerate. The second element here is reforms in the United Nations for the Great Transformation. And there are several elements which we do have in mind and which we discuss in the report. One is that we would like to see the United Nations Environmental Program stronger in the United Nations context. The United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, is actually a weak organization. We would like to see it as strong as other special agencies in the United Nations, for example, the World Health Organization or the International Labour Organization, which would make the environmental pillar in the United Nations context stronger. This is one element. There is another element we argue for with many other researchers and also political actors. We argue for the establishment of a Council for Sustainable Development in the context of the United Nations. It should be as strong and as important as a Security Council in order to organize political debates and decision-making processes in the United Nations for sustainable development on the highest political level. Heads of state need to be part of that. So a Council for Sustainable Development in the United Nations system would be very important. These are only 2 elements of what we see as or describe as necessary in terms of United Nations reforms. for low carbon transformation processes. The third element here is cities, global city alliances. Why cities? Cities are very important because we saw in the course of our lectures that around 70% of the global emissions, which are energy related, are based on emissions in cities. And this percentage is growing because we are confronted with a huge urbanization push in the global society. So cities working together can really make a difference. Even if we do not see progress on the level of states, and even if we do not see progress on the level of global companies, if cities work together, and if cities reorganize their transport systems, and if cities mobilize their citizens towards low-carbon activities, this can make a difference. The alliances of 40 major cities for low-carbon development is already an example. And we discuss in our report many other of these structures which are already there in order to demonstrate that this kind of political activities on the local level can make a very important difference. And it is part of a global governance framework which we do have in mind for the low-carbon transformation. The last point which I do have here on this list is how to reorient international development cooperation. As you know, currently we are investing worldwide around 110 billion US dollars in development cooperation activities. In Europe alone, we are investing 65 billion euros for international cooperation with developing countries. There is a green part and a low-carbon part in all these activities, but we do not have a framework which is absolutely oriented towards sustainable development and low-carbon transformation processes. So we ask for investing in international development cooperation in a way which would really drive into the low-carbon transformation direction. This is nothing which is currently already the case. So international development cooperation is an important area where low-carbon transformation issues need to gain importance. I would like to make a very last point, which seems to be small, but which might be very important. We have been discussing that global cooperation is very important, and we have been discussing that global cooperation is very difficult at the same time. Remember the power shifts. So we reflected on how to implement global perspectives into nationally oriented foreign policies. And we argue in our report to have in our German ministries, for example, 15% of employees in our ministries being non-Europeans, in our development ministry, in our economic ministry, in our research ministry. And the idea is to bring global perspectives into our national political systems. This would help us to internalize global perspectives and different interests worldwide into our national policy-making processes. And therefore, this might be a contribution to global governance reforms also. So these have been the 4 areas which I wanted to focus on from the 10 areas which we are discussing in our report. And the last sentence which I would like to say before we go to our last slide where we bring together areas of discussion for you, the last element which I want to focus on is that we are making the difference between big push strategies on the one hand side and what we call polycentric strategies on the other hand side. We borrowed the term polycentric strategies from Elinor Ostrom. Polycentric strategies implies that we do have many bottom-up initiatives which in their addition might make a very important contribution to low-carbon transformation processes. And we discuss a long list of these bottom-up strategies. And on the other hand side, we see several big push initiatives which can produce change in a shorter period of time. The low-carbon international emission trading scheme, which we discussed, is such a big push. But we all know that organizing big push strategies are very difficult internationally and even in national societies. So we argue for bringing big push strategies wherever possible together with bottom-up strategies wherever possible and necessary in order to organize the most effective policy package which is in any context possible and feasible. Polycentric strategies and big push strategies bringing together those might make an important difference. So these are the exercises for self-study. Discuss the most relevant areas of action to enable the low-carbon transformation. And discuss these most relevant areas of action going back to the lectures which you already have been listening to. Because you need to make a judgment whether the policy implications and policy packages we come up with are compatible with the problem analysis which we discussed in earlier lectures already. Discuss then, please, the relevance of the bottom-up initiatives vis-à-vis the big push elements which I have been talking about a minute before. Go into your country context. Where do you see bottom-up initiatives which might make a difference? And where do you see options and opportunities for big push elements? This is very different from country to country, so make country comparisons which help you to understand in which countries you can go for strategy A or B. The third kind of exercise which I would like to mention here is name and discuss the criteria which we started with for transformative strategies. Discuss the criteria, reflect whether these are convincing in terms of these are the elements we need to have transformative policies, and then look into the policy bundles. Are the policy instruments which we are recommending there, are they compatible with the criteria which we are discussing and suggesting beforehand? And the last point here in our exercise for your self-study within your discussion groups, give some examples of existing global governance initiatives for low-carbon transformation which you already know. So in your country, in your region, maybe in your city as a global actor. Which kind of elements do you see already, and which kind of elements have the potential to scale them up rapidly? And which kind of global initiatives are slow, maybe blockaded? And should we invest more in them to make them accelerate, or should we go for the easier options? So discuss this kind of opportunity costs for different global governance initiatives for low-carbon transformation processes. So students, this has been the discussion about policy action, about different recommendations for transformative policies towards a low-carbon future. I hope that this was fruitful for your own thinking and reflection on low-carbon prosperities for the next decades to come. And I would like to see in some moment in the future to discuss these kind of issues with you personally. Hopefully I can see you in your universities in any future point in time. Bye-bye.